any reason why in this passage. He just states the command. But if we look over at the book of Colossians in chapter 3 and verse 21, the latter part of that verse, it expresses a why, lest they should be discouraged. So this is an idea of a restatement or a parallel passage that might give us some more information about this idea of not provoking our children to wrath. Another example can be found in the book of Matthew. Y'all remember as Jesus talked about the rich man entering into the kingdom of heaven and how difficult that was. An unqualified statement in Matthew chapter 19, verse 23 to 24. He just states that as a matter of fact, saying it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of God. That's it. We know the response of the apostles within who can be saved. But we also, if we go over to the parallel passage in Mark, he gives us a little more information there in verse 23 and 24, saying how hard it is for those who have riches to enter the kingdom of God. Jesus answered and said, so I didn't provide that information, but he says here in this text that those who trust in riches, it is difficult for them to enter the kingdom of God. And that's, I don't think I got that in there. That's a bad passage up there. I apologize for that. But Mark does say, he inserts in this place of Matthew's rich man, those that trust in riches. So it gives us a little more information in a parallel passage. I'll pause there for a second. Any comments or questions? Yeah, Ruth, go ahead.
This kind of, I think, proves that the Bible is its own best commentary. Mm-hmm. You know, we so many times rely on men's commentaries, but if we look at the scriptures, they explain themselves, and that's part of the parallel passage that you're talking about.
Right.
That's why, because we get more of the picture whenever we look to the scriptures to find out exactly what.
Yeah, so that's the very purpose of last week, today, and next Sunday, is hopefully we come away with, maybe we understood, in some places the Bible kind of interprets itself. But I think we want to come away after 3 Sundays of studying that I didn't realize just how much the Bible does that. Because it does it quite a bit in several different ways. And that's what we're looking at across these 3 Sundays. Thank you for that statement. Anybody, any other thoughts? Anybody else? I've got plenty to say today, so I don't need any comments like I normally do, but I don't want to pass up anybody's comments if you have any. So let's look at the next one, that is repetitions. As an author, a biblical writer continues his exposition, he will undoubtedly, and we've seen this several times, repeat himself and even paraphrase himself as he tries to explain further the subject that he's writing about. And this has been described by some like a painter who, the more he paints, the more that he adds to his painting, the clearer the picture becomes. And we see some biblical writers doing that. For example, Paul in 1 Corinthians 10 returns to something that he discussed in chapter 8. And in so doing, he restates several things. Let's look at some examples. Chapter 10, verse 27 and 28, it's pretty much a repetition of chapter 8 in verse 10. Both are concerned with the possibility of a strong Christian's carelessly engaging in an activity in the presence of a weak brother that might cause him or her to stumble. And he's using repetition to enforce this point. Consider also chapter 8 and verse 13 in 1 Corinthians being repeated again in chapter 10, verse 31 through 33. One of them looks at it from the don't do perspective, while the other one looks at the same idea from the you should do perspective. But it's the same subject that he's talking about both times. Another example of Paul's repetition can be found in a single chapter of Romans, in Romans 14. He begins by discussing 3 steps in his thought in verses 13 through 15. And then he returns to these same 3 steps in verses 19 through 21. And I'll let you read those as I continue on talking about them. Look at each one. So both verse 13 and verse 19 are exhortations. Again, we see one from the don't do perspective, one from the should do perspective. And then verse 14 through the first part of verse 15 is compared to the latter part of verse 20 and verse 21, discussing the wrong it is of leading someone to do something which he thinks is wrong, even though maybe in truth it's not wrong. In this case, it is wrong for the person to practice what he thinks is wrong. To encourage this weak brother to do something that's going to violate his conscience is not walking charitably towards him, right? I heard somebody explain one time, and I like it just because I like bacon, that you're in a buffet line with a Jew who may have just become a Christian and he hasn't ever eaten pork before, and you're just really hounding this guy. You need to try this bacon. It is amazing, and you finally encourage him to do that, and afterwards he feels guilty for doing that. Even though in truth there's nothing wrong with him eating that, for him it is wrong to eat it because he has violated his conscience. An example that I've always liked when talking about this passage. Yes, sir.
Do you have an example of today that's the case? Do you have an example, or can you think of an example where we encourage people to do something when we know it's a violation of their conscience, and we shouldn't be involved in it? I don't care if it's, I don't know, if the brother has some hair covering issues or some, I don't care if it's, there's plenty of things I think where someone's conscience says, I can't do that, or I need to do that. And somehow we think I don't know. I just think sometimes we're very aggressive because we have some truths that maybe they don't have, or maybe we're confused too. But I just think we have to be careful about that.
Yeah, I agree. Nick, do you have a comment?
Well, I think an example that he's talking about is somebody that believes that eating of meat is wrong. They're very strong in their conscience of that, even to the point of pushing that on other people.
Right.
I think that we should be kind and tenderhearted toward them and not push them to accept something that they may not be ready to accept, even though both are perfectly acceptable. Romans 14 talks about various aspects of that, of things that are both acceptable to God and both people that are acceptable, but have differing opinions on those things, and we're to lovingly accept one another.
Right. Good point. I'll mention this. There is an example I can think of that I hesitate to bring up because it could lead our Bible class astray for the rest of the class period. So if you want to talk to me about that example, I'll be glad to talk to you about it privately. But Danny?
Yeah, I was just thinking about our brother Beverly in the one cup.
Okay.
Same thing.
Okay. Yeah. I remember Melvin Curry making a comment one time. He says, for the sake of unity, I'll drink tobacco juice. Talking about those old farmers that are drinking out of this one cup as it comes around. But thank you. Yeah, that's a good example too. So let's look on at some one final one in this passage. The very end, verse 15, the latter part of verse 15, compared to the beginning of verse 20, say 2 things about the weak brother. First, and this really is just a great follow-up to the discussion we just had. First, that Christ died for him, and he is the work of God. 2 things there. The point here being the fact that Christ died for this person is the work of God, and we are not to destroy that. We are not to be uncharitable towards that. So I'll finalize my thoughts there. We're going to move on to the next one about the self-interpretative. Man, that's a tough word this morning. Self-interpretations of some important genres. Before we go there, though, any last comments or questions on this topic? All right, so let's look at that. So the first part of that is promises and threats that we will look at. And the most important characteristic of promises in the Bible, and some of you already know what I'm going to say, is that they are almost always conditional. Almost always conditional. You remember Satan's use of a promise in Psalm 91, and we read that back in Matthew 4 near the beginning of the quarter, verse 11 and 12, when he was tempting Jesus. Jesus attached it to at least one condition, saying, "You shall not tempt the Lord your God." That was a condition of that promise of Psalm 91. And in addition to that, the Bible interprets the promises of salvation, both physical and spiritual, to be conditional. And I think it's clear to see that in the text, especially in the Old Testament. We'll go there in a moment, but before we do, concerning the conditionality of a promise of physical salvation, consider Acts 27. And this is kind of a long passage. I'm not going to go over there and read all that. I don't have one up here, but you remember that in Acts 27, Paul was on a ship journeying to Rome as a prisoner of the Roman government. And in verse 22, Paul promised, he says, "There shall be no loss of any man's life among you," saying in verse 25 that God had told him so. There would not be any loss. Yet then later he warns the soldiers regarding the sailors who were, you remember, trying to flee from the ship because they believed it was about to, break up. It was going to sink. He says in verse 30, he says to the captain, "Except these abide in the ship, they cannot be saved." The condition of what he had already said back in verse 22. It is clear in the context that God's promise of this physical salvation was conditional upon their staying in the ship. If they chose not to, they would lose their life. Considering the conditionality of a spiritual salvation promise, let's look at the book of Ezekiel. I think that's the best place to go see this. Just one example we'll look at in reference to this. In Ezekiel 18, he says, "The soul that sins, it shall die." That soul shall die. Verse 4 and in verse 20, he says that. But then he says in verse 21, "If the soul that sins will turn away from all of his sins, he shall surely live. He shall not die." Right? And then in verse 24, "And if the righteous turns away from his righteousness, shall he live?" That's a rhetorical question. No, he will not. Did I get that one up there? Yeah. So this illustrates to us in a way that though God makes promises about the soul that sins, it shall die. That's a promise. It's conditional upon his repentance, on whether he repents or not. And vice versa, same thing. Any thoughts or questions on promises and threats being conditional? Yes, over here. Go ahead, Jay.
I think a very long and kind of the primary example of this, I think, of is Deuteronomy.
Okay, yeah. Oh, absolutely.
I mean, everything's predicated on if.
Yes.
If.
Especially the latter part, right, of the book, when you get into the blessings and the curses, right?
Yeah.
It's all about if you do this, right?
And it goes both ways.
Right.
In
Exactly.
that passage, Moses is very clear. If you follow the Lord your God, these are the blessings. If you do not follow the Lord your God, these are the curses. But it is kind of that conditional.
I know some people are thinking about this. There's a common denominational belief that this just strikes at the heart of. You thought, what is it?
Saved always.
Exactly. Once you're saved, you're always saved. How does that fit in with the conditional promises? of God, and nearly all of them being conditional. So anyway, just a thought. We could spend the rest of our class on that probably, but let's move on and look at prayers. Prayers is the next genre that I want to look at in reference to self-interpretation. Now, the most outstanding characteristic of prayers that we read in the Bible is that since they are petitions to God, who is both the first cause and the main cause of all that happens in the world, right? They generally overlook the operation of the secondary cause, and that is the part that we play. However, these prayers do not deny that we play a part in them, nor does it deny God's use of the part that we play. Does that make sense? For example, Jesus taught the disciples to pray to God, "Give us this day our daily bread." Matthew 6 and verse 11. Although Jesus does not mention the fact that we have to labor for acquiring of our food, it in no way suggests that that's not necessary. Right? Jesus is not saying, God, give us this day our daily bread without having to work for it. Just give it to us. That's not what Jesus is saying in the prayer. But he is acknowledging that God has a main cause part in that without denying that we have that secondary part, that we have to labor for it. One more, consider also how that although God granted Hezekiah chapter 15, y'all remember when God grants Hezekiah 15 more years of life. He had told him, put your house in order, you will not survive this sickness. And he prays to God, God gives him 15 more years. After he prayed, asking God to extend his life, God still required him, if you'll recall the story, to put a plaster of figs on the boil. Now, if he hadn't have done that, God's promised me 15 more years. Why do I have to put that on there? I'll just go do what I want. I think implied in there is that God would not have given him the 15 additional years. Any thoughts? Yep, Jim?
In that Hebrews 11, completely is by faith someone did something that they believe God was true.
Yep.
Did something that God gave them this, and this is what happened. That's another one. God says, I give you 15 years, this is what you do. By faith he did it, and he got 15 years.
Right.
That's how, and that's in that our relationship with God also.
Exactly.
God made promises, this is what I want you to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thoughts? I'm probably saying some things a lot of us in this room, we already understand that, but these are things, interpreting the Scriptures, I think we have to believe to come to a correct conclusion of what the Scriptures are teaching us. Otherwise, we come to the conclusion that once we're saved, we're always saved, right? Let's look at another one. This is the fun one, right? Prophecies and predictions. There is a number of these in the Scriptures. The Hebrew writer explains the prophetic word to be varied in form or appearance when he says that God, at various times and in various ways, spoke to the fathers by the prophets. Very first verse of the book of Hebrews. And since God uses many methods in giving his prophetic word, or he did, we must not put it into a straitjacket or just one method or form. In other words, the prophetic word is not to be construed as all literal. When we're talking about prophetic word. All literal, nor is it to be all figurative or all anything else. And many people have twisted the Scriptures by doing that. So, this is all literal. And come to a wrong conclusion about what the book of Revelation is talking about, or Daniel's talking about in some of his prophetic words. So there's a twofold validation of fulfillment. Now, think about it. I'm going to try to put this in very easy terms. It's not complicated. First of all, a prophecy is made, a prediction's made, and it comes true. An actual fulfillment that validates the prophecy or the prediction as true, right? Well, we can just physically see, yep, it came true. So it was a true prophecy. Another way that I want to look at briefly here this morning is when there's given some type of divine signpost. Did I get? So that's going to be what I have up here for Joel. So what I mean by a signpost is that we see a this is that in the scriptures. It may not be obvious that it was fulfilled, like the destruction of Nineveh. If we consider actual fulfillment, think about the destruction of Nineveh. You know, Jonah predicted in his prophecy, he comes into Nineveh and he prophesies 5 Hebrew words. 40 days and Nineveh shall be destroyed. Or, I don't think destroyed was the right word, the same word my version uses, but the idea is the same. And after Jonah prophesied of its destruction, had they not repented, 40 days later the destruction actually happened. That would be an unquestionable fulfillment of the prophecy that Jonah had prophesied. But when we consider things that aren't so obvious, a divine signpost, this statement, this is that, when God points to an event, regardless of whether it is apparent or not, and in effect says that this event is the fulfillment of so-and-so, that statement validates the fulfillment, the actual fulfillment of it. And a great example of that is when Peter, in Acts chapter 2, says this. Y'all remember what happened in Acts chapter 2, that these tongues of fire appeared on the apostles, and they began speaking in different languages, and the people were looking at that. And what were their thoughts when they looked at all this? They were confused. Yeah, and they were like, oh, these guys must be drunk. You know, and that's Peter's first statement when he starts talking. You know, these are not drunk as you suppose, as it is only the 3rd hour of the day. But this is that which was spoken by the prophet Joel. Now, I want to go over to, I should have marked Joel in my Bible, because now I'm going to have to ask my wife where Joel is, like I normally do. But, well, I can go over to Acts chapter 2 and just read it, right? That's the easiest thing to do, because he quotes it over there. So in Acts chapter, read this. So this is what he says is happening there on the day of Pentecost. He says, it shall come to pass in the last days, says God, this is Joel's prophecy, that I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your young men shall see visions. Your old men shall dream dreams. And on my men servants and on my maidservants, I will pour out my spirit in those days, and they shall prophesy. I will show wonders in heaven above and signs in the earth beneath, blood and fire and vapor of smoke. The sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the coming of the great and awesome day of the Lord. And it shall come to pass that whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. Now, question, do the events that Peter and Luke observe on this day look like the events that were just described by Joel in verse 28 through 32 of Acts 2, of Joel 2? I mean, to me, they don't look anything like it. Blood, smoke. I mean, but Peter is telling them, this is the fulfillment of Joel's prophecy. So we have this divine interpretation of Joel's prophecy to tell us this is that. And so that verifies. That's 2 ways. First of all, it either actually happens where it's unquestionably observed. Yep, that's a fulfillment of that prophecy. Or we have some type of divine this is that telling us this is a fulfillment of that prophecy. That's the 2 ways we've seen that. By the way, I think the idea there is when he describes this blood and fire and vapor of smoke, and the sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood. It describes to me a change in kingdoms. If you think about physical warfare, and they go into battle, and there's fire and there's smoke, and it'll cover up the sun, and all of these things describe one kingdom being conquered by another kingdom. And I think that's exactly what's happening here spiritually. God's kingdom is taking over the kingdoms of the world. And today he still rules. Did I see a hand over here? Yeah, Jeff.
Same chapter, Acts 2, is starting at verse 25. Is that another fulfillment?
In verse 25? I think in verse 25, he's correcting, he's wanting to make a point. It is a fulfillment. Actually, the raising of Jesus was the fulfillment. When he talks about he will not allow his Holy One to see corruption. He's just making the point. Don't think that means David. It was Jesus. That is a fulfillment. When Jesus rose from the dead, it was a fulfillment. Yes, that is a good example. Another good example we have of a signpost that describes to us the fulfillment of a passage. Yes. Now, I want to think about, before we get out of that genre, is the possibility of non-fulfillment of a prediction or a prophecy. Since a prediction is almost always conditional, it won't come to pass if the condition does not come to pass. We've talked about that a little bit. Thinking about Jeremiah, about the nations, and Ezekiel, about individuals, both explain that predictions are conditional and they will not come to pass if the status before God of those nations or those individuals qualitatively or they change. I don't know if I have the Jeremiah passage in here or not. Yes. Jeremiah 18, verse 7 through 10 describes that. The instant I speak concerning a nation, we already looked at the Ezekiel passages talking about individuals. The soul that sins, it shall die. Here about nations. The instant I speak concerning a nation and concerning a kingdom to pluck up, to pull down, to destroy, if that nation against whom I have spoken turns from its evil, I will relent of the disaster that I thought to bring upon it. So there is a non-fulfillment of prophecy if the condition is not met. Any thoughts, questions, comments further on prophecies and predictions? Yes?
Well, we have one prediction and prophecy that has not been fulfilled yet, and this is showing us that Jesus.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
This is showing us, all this shows us that that's going to happen.
Yeah, very good point. That's absolutely right. We need to take that away from what we're studying today, this particular thing, that all the fulfillment of prophecies, that all the things God has promised us today, not one single thing has failed, as long as the condition was met, right? So we can rest assured that he'll fulfill the rest of them that's left. Jim?
When Jonah says, the city is going to be destroyed, you don't read anything about them. He didn't say, well, he must have said it, but if you repent, God will relent. Do you think that after God relents, that these people all did sacrifice actions and beg for forgiveness and so forth? But do you think there's people after that that said that prophecy didn't come true? I mean, would you believe the Lord? I mean, isn't that a reason Jonah didn't want to do it?
Exactly. That was the point I was going to make. Yeah, some people might say that, but my point would be that's the whole reason Jonah didn't want to go. I knew you to be a merciful and compassionate God. He knew that if they repented, God would relent from the disaster. And Nineveh was his enemy, was Israel's enemy, and he did not want them to be spared from that. He wanted them to be destroyed, and he knew God would relent going into that. So very good point. Appreciate you bringing that up.
It also shows that God does prophecy, man cannot change.
Yeah,
Man cannot
yeah.
do something to prevent it from happening. Jonah's a good example.
Yes, yeah. He can't change God's compassion and mercy not to fulfill the that it be not conditional. Yeah, good point.
George,
Yeah.
the whole time we've been talking about this, I keep thinking about Jeroboam, the first king of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
God chose him because Solomon had been faithful. He said that he would divide the kingdom, right? But he told Jeroboam, and this is in 1 Kings chapter 11, and then it shall be, if you heed all that I command you, walk in my ways, and do what is right in my sight, to keep my statutes and my commandments, as my servant David did, then I will be with you and build for you an enduring house, as I built for David, and will give Israel to you.
Yeah.
There was the condition. He said, I'm going to do the same thing for you that I did for David when
Yeah.
I built the kingdom. But you have to be faithful. You have to walk my ways and my statutes. If you do, I'm going to build you a house like David.
Right.
And he did it. And God took it away from his family line.
Yeah. And I'll say this. You ever wonder why 1 Kings 13 is in the Bible? You know what that story, you remember the story about the prophet who goes to Jeroboam, prophesies against him on the way back. He's met by the other prophet and tells him, God told me to tell you to come in. Because God had told him, you go give the prophet and you come straight back. You don't turn to the right or left. And this other prophet comes and lies to him, and then the lion kills him. Y'all remember that story? You ever wonder why that's in there? It's to illustrate exactly what Jeroboam had done. That Jeroboam didn't do what God told him to do, and as a result, he's going to lose his life. He's going to lose what God promised him. Good point. Thank you very much for that. Let's look at this last one, parables. So we'll spend a little more time on these. Hopefully, we'll spend the rest of our time for sure. These are kingdom illustrations or likenesses. Jesus says, the kingdom of heaven is like thus and so. Matthew 13 is full of these parables. In the Bible, we see two basic kinds of parables. The first one is ordinary illustrations used to describe likenesses of extraordinary things. And then we also have a few extraordinary illustrations or likenesses of an extraordinary thing. First, let's look at the ordinary. Almost all the parables are this kind, in that they portray matters of ordinary human life that show to be like the kingdom in some way or in some ways, or vice versa. For example, the kingdom of heaven, the extraordinary thing, is like a merchant man seeking goodly pearls, the ordinary thing. Matthew 13, verse 45. Now, in the case of extraordinary things, in this case, a specific kingdom example is used to illustrate a kingdom principle. Now, there are only 4 of these, all of which are in the Gospel of Luke. Namely, the Good Samaritan, the rich, foolish farmer, the rich man and Lazarus, and the Pharisee and the publican. Those are the 4 extraordinary things explaining extraordinary things. Now, all 4 of these parables are the perfect ideal or spiritual example of the principle that is being considered. And we'll consider an example in a moment. So the way to understand parables, the first type of parable requires one to make the following steps I would suggest to you. First, get the overall point of this particular aspect of life that is being portrayed by the ordinary story. What is he pointing out about the ordinary story? And then make an application of it to the principle of the kingdom, which seems to be most like it. In other words, the main point of the story becomes the main principle of the kingdom be considered. Jesus apparently appeals to our human ability to do this very thing when he says, he that has ears to hear, let him hear. He says it more than once. Luke 14:35 is one example. I think the second thing, to see how then the explanation of this parable is a sample of how all others are to be explained, since they're all basically alike, right? They're all basically the same. Jesus explained the parable of the sower for this very reason. You remember when he says, before he explained it, he says, do you not understand this parable? How then will you understand all the parables? So there's the idea. And in the interpretation of this parable, Jesus, and this is the parable of the sower, Jesus is providing a divine process for interpreting all parables. You'll notice when he describes the parable of the sower, he does just what I said before. Consider the actual life, real life story, the ordinary story. Get the point that's being made there, and then apply it to the kingdom principle. Now, I think the second type, I'm going to stop there for just a second. Comments, questions, before we look at the other four real quickly. Any thoughts there? Does it make sense? You just get the point of the actual ordinary story and then apply it to the kingdom principle. So let's look at the extraordinary. I think this parable requires that we come to see the kind of character that the parable is portraying. And in so doing, we then can understand the spiritual character. So sometimes Jesus himself makes the obvious explanation in order to drive the point straight to the heart. For example, he points out regarding the rich, foolish farmer, so is he who lays up treasures for himself and is not rich towards God. That's the end of the whole parable. He makes the point for us. Luke 12, verse 21. And in other times, a gospel writer may explain the point in a parable of Jesus. For instance, Luke says, the parable of the Pharisee and the publican was spoken to certain which trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others. You know, but even without Luke's interpretation, isn't it obvious that that's the very idea on the very surface of the story about the Pharisee and the publican? Isn't that easy to see in that particular story? So the principle of those who saw themselves self-righteousness and despised the other people, you can see that very clearly in the Pharisee, right? So I'm out of notes now, so I'm going to open it up for final thoughts and comments and questions. David, you've been awful quiet today. So, Jamie?
Back to the first part.
Okay.
I mean, one of my favorite yet heartbreaking ones is Isaiah 53.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And maybe everybody in here knows about that one, but if you don't, I encourage you to read it because
Yeah.
it's just a beautiful, heartbreaking description of what
Mm-hmm.
Jesus went
Does it ever perplex you when he says in that text? It did for me for a long time. It pleased God to bruise him. I just didn't understand that for a long time. But came to realize that he meant that it was his sacrifice was satisfactory. It fulfilled what God's nature required. Right? Remember what he said in Hebrews? It was not possible that the blood of bulls and goats could do that, could take away sin. But his sacrifice could. Thanks for that comment. Any other last thoughts, questions? We've got about 1 minute, maybe 30 seconds left. All right, I appreciate your participation this morning. We'll finish up next Sunday with part 3 of our study. Do what?
Green 4 water.